Well, I am not sure that I know exactly what it is that you want. So, in many ways, you'll be guiding the conversation. And we'll see where it takes us.
That's what I like to do. Sometimes, I write down questions, and a lot of people do interviews where they have a list that they go down. Particularly, I kind of find it's better just to maybe have a direction and then just kind of go wherever the path leads you.
Well, I sort of do. After each presentation that I've done in the past however many years, I realize that I'm not totally comfortable. It is as if the pain that I experienced was really not mine. My parents, neighbors, and I can't say relatives because there are very few actually that survived.
Yes.
So I, in fact, turned to my brother, who's 2 years younger, and said, "Do you refer to yourself as a victim of the Holocaust?" And he says, "Oh, absolutely." I said, "Wow, I struggled with that designation." And there's my brother who has no qualms about it. And if I, and this is not to blame him or accuse him of anything, he's 2 years younger, so his questions were different. That allowed me to be more comfortable with that designation because I realized that my sense of suffering, experiencing the evils, was real. And then, particularly once we got to Poland, the conversations were more and more plentiful. Now, it's true that many of the survivors did not really share their experiences, but they were witnesses to the, how should I put it, the shared experiences of those who were older and in a position to suffer more. But I realized also that throughout all those years, post-war years, I felt part of that group. I had dreams, supposed recollections of things that happened. And it was easier and easier to talk about it, to share some of it. Do I have regrets? Yeah, I didn't ask enough questions. My parents didn't volunteer more than the minimum. And to this day, I say I should have sat down and talked to them. But that wasn't easy. It wasn't easy because they had problems with it too. Throughout the years, I learned that they were certainly victims. They lost the families. I didn't even know them. Would I have lived this differently? Absolutely. I would have asked, I would have shared, and it took me all these years to finally come to terms with what should have been probably a daily routine.
Of asking them or talking to them about
That's
it.
Right.
Yeah.
Some of the incidents told a story that they could not verbalize themselves.
Mm-hmm.
It was decades before I discovered that they didn't just leave the two of them alone for Russia, that they took a younger brother. But when they were stopped by the Russians at the border, the Russians were very clear about it. Said, look, if you go together, we need people to work the coal mines because most of the men are, are not workers who were in a position to provide help. Yes, the Russian men were at the front, and so that was established. In any case, when they were asked to make a decision, they chose to send that younger brother back. And they said, look, you're not healthy, and having you with us will not only be a major burden, but also it will be too young. You are too young to absorb it and to share it. It's interesting because it was Elie Wiesel who at one point said that witnesses to the conversations and stories that they were told had an obligation to become witnesses and share that so that it doesn't die with this attempt to share, to discuss.
Yes.
What I found difficult was to get myself into the, how shall I put it, it was difficult because I couldn't come to terms with it. I can imagine how they felt having actually known and lost family. Imagine my father was one of 7, my mother was one of 13 members of the family. But the questions were there, the interest was there, so I shared as much as I could.
As much as what you were able to gather from them during their lives.
Not only that, but that's for sure, that they were caught in this as well.
Mm-hmm.
Just imagine my father at that point, certainly an adult, discovering how his father was killed by a German SS man who was sadistic in his treatment. And I started questioning much of it. What role do I play in this reliving of a major thing? And what was, the older I got, the more I learned about it, because it became part of the school curriculum. It was interpreted for us by adults.
Mm-hmm.
And I eventually got to the point where I wanted to know more. I needed to know more. Today, in retrospect, I view much of the stories as strictly witness accounts. But what's interesting is that during that period of time, I was surrounded by examples of stories that would not leave me. They were, I would have dreams almost nightly for years of being chased by the Germans, chased with dogs, clearly and I would be the one trying to escape. And it's interesting, it was almost daily, nightly, if you will, that I was chased, running, and the closer they got, the more disturbing the dream became.
Mm-hmm.
But I would always wake up at the point where I was almost caught, but not quite, so that I could relive it again.
So do you think this was due to you having heard some of the stories of your parents and people that you knew?
Most of the people that I knew.
That you knew. Yeah.
My parents, surrounded by their own guilt,
Mm-hmm.
survivor's guilt.
Yes.
Particularly when this younger, sickly boy was sent back with the words, look, Siberia, coal mines, I don't know if we could survive. Why don't you go back? And as soon as the war is over, we'll come and get you. Of course, they thought the war would be over, as did many people, both throughout the world, but in Poland. And whenever we would get together with whoever we chose to call family, the more we would discover discrepancies. But one thing was clear. They had an opportunity to save another member of the family, and they chose not to. They chose not to, not because they wanted to disregard it. They chose not to because they thought that they could provide a better standard of living. And the fact is that they did. Now, when they came back to Poland, only to discover that the Red Cross was right. Most of the members of the family were known to have been killed, and they didn't ask too much either, because asking was to create a knowledge base, that didn't put them in the best light. And in any case,
yeah. I was going to ask, maybe you could take me back a little bit, because I believe when you presented during that talk, I believe you mentioned that your family left Poland at the beginning of the war.
Yeah.
Was that right? What were some of the conditions or the signs that they saw that led them to eventually go to a place like Siberia, of all places?
Good question. I always said to my father, boy, you really saw the writing on the wall.
Yeah.
Before most, they were not the only ones. And he said, Michael, if you hear from anybody that they knew what they were doing, don't buy it.
Mm-hmm.
No one knew what was going to happen. In fact, we thought the war was going to be a quickie, and look at it, it wasn't. And so the discussions that they had, that I witnessed, were discussions, stories of how they dealt with it themselves.
Mm-hmm.
If there were survivors within a family, they took care of each other. But there were not too many.
Not too many. I believe, if I remember correctly, Germany invaded Poland in, it was either 1938 or 1939.
39.
Okay.
September 1st.
September 1st.
Yeah.
Okay. And your father worked as a tailor during his life in Poland before the war.
That's right.
So what led them to Siberia? Because seems like a place you probably wouldn't want to go, but even just looking at that history of that place in the Soviet Union, it's
Siberia became assumed and known as a place for punitive, ways of dealing. It wasn't punitive. It's like being sent to Alaska to work in some oil industry.
Okay.
Of course, that's not to deny that Siberia was also a place for punishment. But that wasn't the case with my parents. They were fortunate in that, having worked a little while in the coal mines, they also became storytellers. And the storytelling also became a way of surviving, because once everybody found out that my father was a skilled, accomplished tailor who knew European styles, all these party officials would come up and say, could you make something for me? And they paid with currency. And that was not the official legal currency, but food stamps. Food was not bought with cash. It was always a barter of sorts.
So even though he was working in the coal mines, he was kind of able to do that on the side and kind of do it underground.
Some of it was on the side, but what it was, that he was recognized as a valuable person there, taken out of the coal mines, to essentially do the tailoring and teach it. They did very well. My parents, that is, we. And in fact, I was amazed that my father received a medal for his contribution to the victory of socialism. And of course, he had a picture of Stalin on it, and I foolishly threw it away.
Really?
Yeah, Stalin didn't have much of a reputation of a
I could imagine.
Yeah. My father didn't even understand how did he manage to get a medal. But that's what it was. The post-war period was a period of total chaos. Families were split, those that survived, and but whatever it was, it created a life for the family, for my parents, of accomplishment of a different kind. They moved to a part of Poland that for decades, centuries actually, belonged to Germany. And
this was after the war when they came back from Siberia?
Yeah.
Okay.
Before the war, they were trading, and did quite well for themselves. But they decided to go back to Poland because, as they said, we knew our family. If they had a way to figure out who might have survived, not, it wasn't an easy decision to share because, as they said, we knew our family. They were not going to volunteer that they were Jewish and that they survived. So they didn't even talk that much about the family, which, looking back, I considered a major loss for us. The closest that I came to getting any information about the family was my mother saying, "You look just like my brother," or "You act just like." It was living in the silence of what and how, and they focused on trying to find more witnesses. In the meantime, what's interesting is, in the meantime, they were listening to stories and trying to figure their own story. And the fact is that they couldn't accept the notion that they have a responsibility. See, that's what Elie Wiesel said. Those who witness the stories, who listen to the stories, must themselves become witnesses. And it wasn't always easy. Was the whole subject politicized? Absolutely. didn't fully understand the reasoning, but they knew that that's what happened. And I said that before, but let me re-emphasize it. I wanted to know more. They knew a little more, but not enough to share, to create.
Yeah.
They didn't witness much of the evil.
Which they were in, because they were in Russia
Yeah.
during the whole time, and I couldn't even imagine to think what that's like to be gone for those 4 years and to come back. And I think what you said before is like there were no survivors in their family.
Yeah. But my father started the business, and in fact did very well.
Mm-hmm.
We did not stay very close to this distant, nevertheless still family that survived. There were always some stories that if you think you had it bad, I had it worse.
Yeah.
And to some degree, it was true. But it was also a time of people sharing stories of others, and oftentimes taking those stories for themselves. Things were changing, and I couldn't help but be involved in some of the changes because it was changing the stories. It was becoming clearer about what happened. The notion of staying in Poland was becoming more and more difficult. And eventually they decided that maybe we should leave.
That they should leave. That they should leave?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
My father came to me and said, look, we are here because that's where we grew up. We have lost something here, but your future is not likely to be seen as the best way of survival.
Mm-hmm.
So at first they hemmed and hawed. Eventually, when the anti-Semitism started to grow in Poland, my parents, having spoken to us, and of course when they asked, do you want to leave? Going to America, it was everybody's dream.
Mm-hmm.
And they came back to Poland to a vacuum, to an emptiness. Into Russia or any other countries was more of an issue, more of a problem. But they did.
Yeah. Well, I mean, these countries are probably accepting thousands and thousands of refugees at that time.
That's right. Yeah. It was not unlike today with the immigration issues. You needed to have an affidavit of support from the person who was bringing you, sponsoring you.
Yeah.
It was a lengthy time to get a visa, because that's what you needed, took around 5 years. And when they finally got it, packing for a trip is one thing. Packing for a new life is totally different.
A permanent move.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they managed to do it. For months we lived in a way that was going to define our future, but at that point we didn't know how to even deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
We came to America. Of course, my father wasn't going to look for anything but his trade. I was already at the university in Poland, so I brought an element of forming the future. What will I do? What will I? And that wasn't easy.
And so, in post-war Poland, because I believe you moved to New York when you were 19.
Yeah.
Is that right? And so, so your childhood, the earliest memories of your life were still in Poland at that time.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
What do you remember about that time period?
What do I remember? Well, I remember that as time progressed, especially after Stalin died, which was March 5th, 1953, there were a lot of mixed feelings about his death. Many Jews and non-Jews were grateful to him for winning the war and getting Jews to live, to continue.
The
But there were also issues that nobody questioned. We suffered, and now it was over. And had the situation in Poland not been as filled with anti-Semitism, we probably would have stayed.
Mm-hmm. So I think there might be a misconception out there that, anti-Semitism ended, or the dangers that Jews faced during that time period ended with the war.
Both. What was interesting is that we were doing financially very well. Both my mother and my father were in business together, and to this day I don't understand how they managed to be essentially the opposite of what the Russians expected.
Mm-hmm.
No socialism, he was in a private business. And
he was an entrepreneur. Yeah.
Yeah. Which was also interesting because there were no banks in Poland or any of the other countries where you could go in and say, here's $50,000, put it in my account, invest it. That didn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
became part of the war of words, of propaganda, each accusing the other of being, how should I put it? If socialism, communism were the future, where everybody will be treated properly, then living in the remnant of capitalism was not the best thing to do. But money speaks. And so when we got here, you would think, that's it. We came to the country of freedom. And it wasn't that simple. Anti-Semitism existed amongst Jews directed towards other Jews. And that wasn't really so new because the attitude towards the style of living and things was very different. As I said, there are no banks, so having foreign currency was semi or illegal. And so they continued living this year. The Holocaust has ended, but not for everybody. They were going to check the town where they came from originally to see if other members went there. That seemed like a logical place to go. But because of that pogrom in a city called Kielce was the most visible sign of anti-Semitism.
And that's a pretty infamous pogrom in Poland after the war.
Yeah,
there was some. Yeah, tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, about 2,000 Jews were killed post-war without the Germans there anymore.
And one thing when I did the interview with Sahara Boyd, as I was doing some research about that, and this is something I had to check numerous times because I couldn't believe the figure, but it was 90% of Jews in Poland were killed during the Holocaust and during World War II. So just already that having that little of a population there. And
3 million out of 33 million were Jews. And Cold War started. So it was a period where all the travel between was suspended, and it was a reminder that it ain't over. I look 18, 19, that's a time when you create dreams of your own future. And it was difficult because each story had a different element. Even things like there were German soldiers, Germans, who put their life at risk helping Jews.
Yes.
I don't know if you saw the movie, The Pianist.
I have, with
Brody.
Yes. Yeah.
he was saved by this German soldier who appreciated music. Germans were culturally very advanced, and yet when the Russians took over, the German was sent to Siberia and perished there, even though he was helping. The reasons why were always clouded in mystery, but the fact is that he was sent to Siberia, the other kind of Siberia, and died there. The Russians didn't want Germans to be seen anything but brutal animals. But there are many stories that I would hear. Stories that showed the confusion in who to hold responsible and who to help. In fact, the Cold War eliminate that possibility. These were heroes. Let's take them out. So we lived in this city that was second largest in Germany, territorially. And
I'm sorry, in Germany? You said in Poland?
Well, it was Germany before the war.
Okay.
And Stalin said, I'm going to take some part of Poland on the east side.
Okay.
I'll give you back Silesia, which you claim to be yours. So it will be just a shift.
Okay. Was it more like an extension of East Germany during those days?
But there was no East Germany is a construct created by the Russians.
Okay.
Because the conquerors, the winners of the Second World War, were certainly the British, the Canadian, the Russians, and there was the French. And what happened was they needed to create an understanding, and that was how are we going to deal with immigrants. That's why a lot of people are concerned today.
How to create that us versus them type of mentality.
But immediately after the war, in Europe, there was no such thing as a good German. And so the Russians could not allow for gestures of concern on the part of local Jewish things. I just finished reading a book on the Jewish presence, Jewish attitudes towards those that save Jews. In any case, 1953, Stalin dies, keep going back and forth. And one of the first things that became clear that being Jewish is not the best thing in Poland, even after the war. The irony of it is that many Jews belonged to the Communist Party because the Communist Party, or communism, offered a dream. The notion that you believe in the future being
almost sort of utopian in a sense.
Yeah, that's a very good thing, because communism said from everybody according to his ability to everybody according to his needs. That is a tough one to live with. In fact, Israel, which based its educational form, government view on principles of communism, but not on the reality.
Yes. Yeah.
So the principle is as I stated, but in reality, if you knew the right person, if you stole the money the right way, you surfaced. And
if you stole the money the right way.
That's right.
What do you mean by that?
But look what happened to Russia.
Okay.
All of the communally owned factories, businesses became government.
Right.
Any case, we decided to leave. By the way, I started leading into it and I now jumped off that wagon. Jews were accused of being pro-communist with good reason. And the notion of being I'm trying to find words that would not confuse the issue.
Well, I could imagine during that time period we have an influx of people from Eastern Europe at the time, that especially with the the culture of McCarthyism going on in the United States.
Yeah,
there's a lot of people during that time period who had suspicion of these strangers coming in.
Yeah. And much of those attitudes were not clearly understood. For example, Jews, because they belonged in disproportionately larger numbers to the Polish Communist Party, were treated as friends of the socialist system, but they were also treated as traitors by the Polish underground. There were Germans who helped save Jews. The Russians did not want to accept that technology.
So I think even in Germany there were quite a few people who were anti-Nazi. I don't know the exact figures if it was a minority or how many people in Germany really supported the Nazis. But of course, if you were a Nazi, it seems like you were all in. But there's,
you're
still kind
right.
of a skepticism of them.
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
And so what happened was Poland, who was very Western before the war, could build a system, a modified system, that allowed for more Jews to become successful, and that what destroyed the system was the fact that we're human and we didn't just acknowledge some of the good. There was no such thing as a good German. When I came here, as I said, with the notion of here we are, free at last, or so we thought, and as in any political system, parties, they became ways of getting even with others.
Yes.
Jews were blamed for letting the Russians, when they took over, letting the Russians identify which Jew was for supporting them or which Jews were just not not willing to make peace with the Russians. So there was, so here I am, or we are, came to land of the free. No English, and no connections, no infrastructure that would allow building a new economy. Just the opposite. We came here and one of the, New York was known for the textile industry, and Jews were part of it.
And when you came over, were you in New York City or another?
New York City.
New York City, okay.
But that was true in many respects.
Yeah.
Kind
of an immigrant hotspot.
What?
It's kind of an immigrant hotspot here in New York City. Yeah.
So there was no freedom here. My father, who was a very skilled, trained tailor, suddenly was working piecework with, people who had no idea about tailoring. But they could do that one thing fast, and they were making much more money than he was. And because he would say, look at it, take it apart and do it again. And they were not interested. But the Jewish owners of those factories, because for the most part they were Jewish, in New York anyway, didn't have any respect for the abilities of the new Jews, because American Jews were seen in their own eyes as not only Jews with rights and Jews with control of their future, but they saw the Eastern European migrants, or immigrants actually, in a very different light. So there were no extended arms to embrace us when we came here. There were some organizations that did their job, but for the most part,
Would you say it was probably one of those clashes where you probably have a group of people who've maybe been in the United States for a couple of generations, kind of versus the very recent arrivals at that time?
There were different classes of people, different experiences, and they were seen as less than, particularly the German Jews, who were well established, both financially and politically, and we depended on their embrace, but didn't get it.
Yes.
In fact, New York had the greatest density, New York City, of Jews, and they were treated, in fact, the Jews of the establishment wanted to pass laws to limit the number of Eastern European Jews in New York. They call them animals. These are our own people. So it wasn't this, wow, free at last. None of it. But the notion of education, notion of freedom to pursue whatever you decided you want, was sufficient to keep us here.
And it seems like that notion worked out pretty well for yourself.
Well, I guess so.
In the long run.
In the long run, yes.
Yeah, because
it's interesting. You should pick up on it. One of the things that happened, I started the university in Poland, came here after a year plus with paperwork and everything, and the papers were evaluated for how much education I received, and it turned out that they had to make a decision. They meaning the judges, the professors, had to make a decision. Well, how much education did we already have? When I got my transcript translated and adjusted, I couldn't believe it. We were treated or evaluated by people who had no idea of the system. The European system of university education was very different from the American. And so in any case, so here was a situation. In order to become a matriculated student, you needed to take X number of courses, get an average of B+, and if you could accomplish that, you were in. Well, needless to say, I accomplished that, but the concept of trying to become more educated, more prepared, was seriously treated by the American authorities, but seriously meant also unfairly. Well, European education, college, up to college, was superior to American. So it wasn't that difficult to become, part of the elite. So I suddenly didn't realize, because I was very upset. The guy doesn't know what he's talking about. I should take algebra. I can teach algebra. Because in Europe, the Polish system was, you didn't have to prove and learn things that were taught in high school. The degree that you received in Poland upon finishing high school was the equivalent of the first year of university. No pre-professional courses.
Yeah, it'd almost be like an associate's degree, it'd be an equivalent to that.
Yeah. Any case, I would go to the professor, say, listen, this is my situation. I have taken already courses way beyond this. And they said, okay, so sit in the back and do whatever you need to do. So I sat in the back and I was determined to learn English. And it helped, because the time otherwise would have been split, as with many of my friends who were so proud of themselves that they got the evaluation so much above mine. But soon, we not only caught up, but I moved ahead of them. Anyway, so my point is that immigration is not an instant betterment.
Right. Yeah.
That it still needs to be dealt with, and
there's a lot of work to carving out a life for yourself.
Absolutely.
In a completely different part of the world.
Yeah.
And what was the university you went to in New York? Is that right? Yeah.
City College of New York.
City College of New York.
CCNY.
And is that where, did you get a degree in design there?
No, actually, I got a degree in physics.
In physics? Okay.
Yeah.
Hence the resemblance to Einstein.
Okay. I take it as a compliment.
Yes, I would take it as a compliment, yeah.
Anyway, so, I became an American student at some point. I passed the distinction between being just an immigrant to being a real student. Any case, so no freedom, no exhilaration, no appreciation of how much more I was getting was clear and present. Eventually it became so.
Okay. So through the college years, once you got out of college, I know eventually you made your way down to our area, and I believe that was, you had some kind of connection to the furniture industry here, and
well,
is that, or is that like a long time period between points?
Sort of.
Okay.
I taught physics for a number of years.
Okay. I mean, that's impressive. I mean, to me, that's really impressive, just because when I was going through school, science was not my strong suit.
Okay. And I became a designer because, frankly, in Poland, I didn't consider design as a profession.
Okay.
But I was connected somehow. And I realized that I was never given a real choice. Why did I study physics, not design or architecture? Clearly, the feelings there. Because in part, design was too esoteric, for my parents to consider a real subject matter. But it was for me.
And I mean, physics is one of those subjects that it's a great background for many different things.
Yes,
It provides
absolutely.
a pretty wide array of options to get into.
Yeah. Anyway, we sort of kicked back the notion of the immigrants being treated as second-rate citizens. So jokes of all kinds were a way of dealing with the immigration issue. So, for example, City College of New York, CCNY, was Christian college, now Yiddish. The university had a building downtown New York, and we would call it, because City College was a major producer of PhDs and Nobel Prize winners. So we called that single buildings, where UCLA. You went to UCLA? Yeah. University, corner Lexington Avenue. Humor was often a way that we dealt with situations like
Absolutely.
One was, I'll get even with those Germans. When they make soap out of me, I will not lather. Silly as it may sound, and it is, we got stronger and stronger. And until recently, we were in a good place. Any case.
We say until recently.
Yes.
What do you mean?
Yeah, that's very true. But go ahead. What questions do you have?
Yeah, well, I mean, my grandfather worked in the furniture industry here for 50 years, so I'm kind of interested in hearing about how you got involved in that. But maybe before I get there, I would maybe like to know when in your life that, and maybe it was while you were still growing up in Poland, you were aware of the history you were born into, or if it was maybe later in life where you began to have a more of an interest in it. But when would you say that you kind of became fully aware of the situation that you grew out of?
Well, that's a tough question.
Okay.
Because I was still trying to capture my presence within the context of America versus Russia. And that wasn't always easy. Americans were not known for critical evaluation of communism. For example, we, how should I put it? We were at first tolerated, and then that became more and more successful, embraced, and the education system, for example, many teachers, particularly in centers like New York, were Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It must have had an impact on us, how we felt, how success was measured. But I was drawn to design, even in Poland. In fact, when we had to do create a paper, out of components,
Mm-hmm.
I was drawn to it and did this project, and the teacher wanted to know, where did I get it? Didn't believe that I could have the talent to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And the challenge was interesting because in most professions, you invest in it and you hope that the investment will pay off. Not with art, not with design. But I was skilled enough, naturally, to do these things. And eventually I said, let me do this. Because unlike other areas where, as I said, you invest in, but you don't know the impact.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know how good you are.
Yeah.
With art and design, people look at it and says, I want it, I buy it. So there was a distributor of acrylic, lucite, whatever you want to call it. And I would stop by and get some scraps. And because in the beginning I taught in a vocational school, I had access to all the tools. So I started making things. Fell in love with it. Why? Because the results were not in the future, they were here and now. So I continued extending my leave of absence till it became clear that that's my new profession.
What were some of the first things you designed?
Well, it started out with my ex-wife saw a piece of furniture, a lucite table with a light built into it, and wanted to buy it. And I said, why don't I design and make one? And I did.
Okay.
And everybody loved it, including myself.
Okay.
And then I get more and more seriously involved, connected to it.
Yeah. And this was some of the years after college, when
you
got more into this.
I was still in graduate school.
Okay.
But I think I did well. As a matter of fact, I know I did well.
Yeah.
And but then I started getting involved in other aspects of my life, and that is Holocaust related. And here I am, back to the thing.
Mm-hmm. So getting into design, one of the first pieces you've made, or at least one of the first pieces that other people found value in and really appreciated was a piece of furniture.
Yeah.
So at what point did you end up moving from New York down to our area, and were you...
This is only 5 years ago.
Really? Only 5 years ago? Really?
Yeah.
Okay, so that recent.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
I wanted to inspire design.
Okay.
And the appreciation came from people's reaction. When somebody said, "Oh, you made a dining table for me, but you didn't sign it." I said, "All right," so I signed it, and things like this. Then, of course, I came here during a fascinating political time, Vietnam War, Korean War. But I had to be very careful because there was a risk of being deported.
So you couldn't get too political. Yeah.
That's right. And then here I am.
Okay. And so what was the main reason from moving down here? Because you moved here from New York, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Was it a university connection or more just, yeah?
I knew about North Carolina being a capital center, furniture center of the world.
Yes.
And so I saw the understanding of who I am and who I've become as a sign of progress. And to this day, the notion that design can be seen as a serious profession that contributes to society was seriously taken.
Yeah.
And, well, look, when you said to an American that we're doing design, a lot of, particularly in Poland, said, "What is design?" In Israel, we at some point designed furniture for an Israeli kibbutz. And when we talked about getting paid for this, they said, "Design? What is design? What do you come here, you draw something, and you want to get commission on this?" I said, "Yeah, that's how it works." Didn't like it. But we did it. So becoming a designer was not a major step down.
Yeah.
So I came here. First thing was connection with the university.
Awesome. Okay. And you were telling me about how you got into designing Holocaust memorials.
So, for the most part, each synagogue appeared to have some Holocaust survivor. And brought up the question of how do we commemorate. And one of the things was have memorials within the congregation, not public space. Of course, they were open to the public, but so when we were doing work on designing sanctuaries and the notion of reaching to the Holocaust survivors within that congregation and interpreting, and became one way of dealing with memorials. And because it was obvious that I was not American born, we would create images that spoke both to the Holocaust survivor families as well as Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And slowly we would, we would always say, we are just the interpreters of what you want. And they would get them to discuss it. And out of that, we found meaning. And the more meaning you find, the more deeper you get into it. I wanted to be sure that whatever we brought into it spoke back. So if somebody walked by and saw the image, they would stop and say, why am I reacting? What is it that I'm reacting to?
So when you're trying to invoke an emotional response from
Yes,
it.
absolutely. We became more and more skilled in dealing with it, and then we started branching out into not just interior, you had to walk into the synagogue, but first outside of the synagogue, and then eventually not connected with the synagogue. And the biggest one is, of course, the San Juan, Puerto Rico Holocaust Memorial.
In San Juan, Puerto Rico?
Yeah.
Really? Okay.
I
was thinking that y'all did one maybe like in Arizona or somewhere out west. I don't know how many y'all done, but is that the main one you would say is the one in San Juan?
I would say yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And to this day, so it became okay. We're Jewish. We accept it, we acknowledge it, and move on. I did not choose Holocaust memorials as a field. The field chose me.
Mm-hmm.
And to this day, I find that it is the most soul-searching way to deal with Holocaust memorials. So we started asking ourselves, what is it about the Holocaust memorial that is meaningful to those who didn't have family, didn't have family that was destroyed, and we're still doing it.
Is there any current projects that you're working on related to that?
Well, there was. We retired over 5 years ago.
Okay.
And I tell everybody, we're retired. That's it. Then we get a call from this rabbi that we knew. I said, look, all the years we've been talking about it, and I always said, when we're ready to redo ours, you're the ones.
Hmm.
And he said, this is the time.
Okay.
how could you say no to that? And it turned out to be a major project.
Okay.
So
was that the San Juan one, or one you're still in the progress?
That one was not so much in a memorial, but it was designing with the idea of what was done to us and how should we react to it. We're still, but we are retired. There has to be an end to things.
Yeah.
And there's still a couple of things floating, but for the most part, I would like to say Bonnie and I retired.
Okay. And how do you deal with that question of looking at what yourself and folks in your family came out of, and how you, I guess, not only just cope with it and then move on from it? Because I mean, it seems like getting into that projects, working on these memorials, is a very solemn and meaningful way to at least acknowledge it and to have it stick in people's memories.
One of the things was the fact that we embraced those Holocaust survivors of the synagogue, so that it was meaningful to them. And then they can serve as witnesses again. And then realized actually that here we are, the Bible Belt, and things like Holocaust memorials are not being addressed. So we're still sort of dealing with it. But for the most part, yes, we are retired. And that's the end of it. Yeah.
So if someone wants a memorial, it probably takes a lot of convincing on your part. Trying to relax maybe a bit more these days.
And actually, it's a tough one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because you're doing a memorial to people who don't have a direct connection for the most part.
Okay.
People who try to understand the Holocaust but having had no connection with it. That's a tough one. So the one in San Juan was approached from a maybe somewhat different point of view. We, rather than focus on the suffering and the death, we decided to approach it in terms of what impact did it have on primarily Jewish community. So we leave that aspect aside, and we start out by saying to the committee, to the congregation, tell us what it is that you expect. What is it that you would like? And then have a dialogue that gets interpreted into physical things.
Okay. So it sounds like you're trying to capture the sentiments of that community there, as far as what they want to get out of it.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I guess if you just moved here about 5 years ago, I probably assumed you probably didn't have too much to do with the Temple of the High Country.
No, it was already established.
It was already established.
Yeah.
And I believe you have done some work or some design for them at some point. What are, I guess, maybe some of the projects inside that temple that people who are locally could go see and appreciate?
The most available is a Hanukkah menorah, which we decided to light the Jones house, and it was very successful.
Okay.
But the theme was the title of it was "In the Shadow of Their Absence."
Mm-hmm.
The notion that a memorial could capture an essence of a historical event is not a simple one. So I think that we had to present it so that the experience teaches you not just about evil, but about loss, about, out of 3.3 million Jews, 3 million that's Polish Jews.
Yeah, Poland, okay.
Yeah. I think that in addition to future discussions, the idea that we could engage the congregants here and now in what it is that they want, who is it for, made it into a much bigger, complex event. So there we are.
Yeah, so that's probably safe to say that you still practice their religion.
Yeah.
Because sometimes people I speak to, sometimes I believe when I spoke to Dr. Boyd, it didn't sound like they were active in any kind of synagogue down in Winston. But I'm kind of curious as to how you approach that.
Well, the approach depends on who the people we're making it for.
Mm-hmm.
The understanding, for example, I said that this one is, we live in the shadow of their absence.
Yeah.
I don't know how many people by themselves, on their own, will say, this Holocaust had an impact on our community. Not only did it diminish it, but also it did not necessarily capture, the feelings, if there are any. For example, we believe that the result of the Holocaust memorials being public is that people will start thinking and addressing what happened. I would like to think that, especially in areas that did not experience it directly, personally, that there is an understanding of what impact it really did have. For example, when we say, okay, so X number of Jews were killed. What it means is direct impact on the families, friends, and all of that. But also, it means that we can conceptualize the fact that these people who were killed never had a chance to grow up and be whatever it was.
Yeah.
So not only did we lose people, we lose the future of those that could have been more. And
The potential of those human lives.
Yeah.
The ways they could have given to society.
That's right. That's right.
Gone on to do things like you've done with your life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but we'll see what happens. America is still there and still protective of, and we plan to go back to some of the communities to go back and say, did it do anything? And if it did, what did it do? And that's where we stand now.
Yeah. And in some of these communities, do you find other child survivors or?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, sure.
Because when I was working at a paper and as I've done some work with the center at App State, I think when I was getting my journalism degree, going there the first time for my bachelor's, I was kind of shocked or maybe just astounded that there still be people alive today that recollect or remember at least part of this history.
Yeah.
So I got very interested in hearing people's stories.
That's great.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if ever know anyone who wants to sit down with me and document it, I'd be happy to speak with them.
Most will say yes.
Yeah. And from talking with Amy, it sounds to be that the children of the people who experience it directly like what she was saying, at least in her experience, is just much more experience with knowing and talking to these people. That the children of the survivors tend to be much more willing to talk and share their stories, whereas the first generation, like you were saying, they just very reluctant to speak of it because, as I'm sure when they do, and something I try to be sensitive of is that when people share their stories, they're often reliving it in their mind.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. So as you came up here, how did you wind up getting involved with the Center for Judaic Holocaust and Peace Studies?
I reached out.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a simple.
I'm sure they're happy to hear from you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And donated some books and things, and
what do you think the impact is of people? Maybe you just, from your background, having lived the life you lived, or even just people who may not have that direct experience of getting involved and maybe even supporting some of these centers here at App State and others across the country, but especially here at App State, I hear a lot of good things about the center we have here.
Yeah. It's not a clear-cut situation, and not every member of the community, our community, is willing to extend themselves, and they'd rather just put it aside, which is not that atypical. I don't know, I think that the notion of loss being so overwhelming that it's very difficult not to continue memorializing.
Yeah.
today.
Okay. Yeah. Well, Mr. Michael Berkowicz, I greatly appreciate you sitting down with me and sharing your story and getting to hear it again, and hopefully get it to more people who will, hopefully appreciate it and learn from it and take it and absorb it and, make it a part of how, they view the world and can hopefully expand their horizons and their perspectives. So, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.